So today we are continuing our series in Revelation. We're going through the 7 letters of Revelation, the messages to each of the churches. Last week we looked at the letter to Ephesus, and this week we turn to Smyrna, which I will try not to mispronounce today, even though I'll probably say it 50 times. So here we are. I'm going to start with just reading the scripture, and we'll have the words on the screen as well. The idea behind the series, the title of the series is that Jesus is the resurrected King, and he is alive, he is reigning as King, and he is Lord over the churches, and he has a word for each of these 7 churches of Revelation, and that there's a sense that we get to kind of overhear the message that he's giving to each of these churches, and then we get to be challenged by the Spirit that continues to speak. And you'll see that every one of these messages, like today, will start with what Jesus is saying to the church, and then it will end with this kind of, what is the Spirit saying to you, right? And are we going to listen? So let's read together. You can follow along as I read, and the words will be on the screen. To the angel of the church in Smyrna write, these are the words of him who is the first and the last, who died and came to life again. I know your afflictions and your poverty, yet you are rich. I know about the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not be afraid of what you're about to suffer. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. Be faithful even to the point of death, and I will give you life as your victor's crown. Whoever has ears, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who is victorious will not be hurt at all by the second death. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. So do you remember when there were actual physical bookstores, when there were Christian bookstores even? I know there's probably still a few of them around, but most of the ones that I used to go to are no longer in existence. But I always liked going to Christian bookstores growing up, but probably because I'm a little bit of a weird person, that I like books. I like to read, and I like books. But as anybody who knows, who's been to a big bookstore, especially a Christian one, you will know that books are not really even the reason that those stores existed, right? That in fact, the main reason is it's kind of like a Barnes & Noble, right? If you go into a Barnes & Noble, those usually still are around, right? You walk into the store, and when you walk in the walkways and everywhere, basically, there are board games and toys and trinkets, and usually has some theme of like a book that was made into a movie, right? Like that's usually what you see in bookstores, right? It's all this other stuff. And in Christian bookstores, at least half of the store was other stuff, right? Not books. Things that you could hang on your wall. Like if you go to my mom or grandma's house today, you could see a bunch of these kinds of things, right, that were bought at Christian bookstores. Like stuff to put on your wall, blankets with the Lord's Prayer, maybe a pillow with the footprints in the sand poem, right? Fish decals that you put on the back of your car, and lots of CDs, right? But probably the most ridiculous thing that were in Christian bookstores, which I did have a few of myself, was Christian Bible action figures. Like characters from the Bible, right? Like I had a Samson and I think a David and Goliath, and you could pretend to fight the Philistines, right? But what do you do if you had an action figure Jesus? I don't think we ever actually had the action figure Jesus, but they are available. They were available, right? Because in my experience with action figures as a kid, like you usually don't like sit and teach or feed the hungry with action figures, right? Usually you use them to fight, right? And so I'm not sure what we were doing with the Jesus action figure anyway. And I kind of thought these things were a thing of the past, something I hadn't really thought about, but what jogged my memory about all of this was that I saw shared on Facebook a couple weeks ago a picture of something that's actually even more ridiculous than the action figure Jesus. Now, and I have a picture of it, they have plush life-size Jesus, right? So he's squishy. You can hug him like the girl is doing in the picture, right? And if you find this cute, I'm not trying to make you feel ashamed, but I kind of am. I'm not really sure what the purpose of life-size Jesus is, making him a giant stuffed animal, but they are available on Amazon today if you want one. But all of that kind of stuff in the kind of Christian bookstore complex is easy to kind of poke fun at, right? It's easy to see life-size plush Jesus as a way that we've kind of turned the Christian faith into something to be bought and sold, right? We've kind of turned faith into a commodity in different ways, right? And obviously there were good motives behind it, right? People wanting to teach people about the Bible and, right, if we're going to have Batman and Spider-Man action figures, why not, David and Goliath, right? So I'm not trying to say it's terrible, but you do see, right, the way that, and I think the Jesus stuff really shows this, that we've taken really important things that we've based our whole life around, Jesus himself, the living, resurrected Christ, and turned him into a stuffed animal, right? And there's something kind of weird about that. And the truth is, though, that the spirit of consumerism that makes faith something to be bought and sold is usually much more subtle than that, right? It's much more subtle than life-size stuffed animal Jesus. For instance, as pastors, let's start with us. We are trained in all kinds of corporate models of leadership, right? We get kind of taught how to lead churches as visionary CEOs, right? And we have mission statements and core values and all of these things that are kind of brought from the business world and adopted by churches, right? And now it would be hard pressed to find a church that didn't have those things, right? Churches have business and marketing strategies too, right? We have logos and branding and advertising, right? Social media has added a whole nother level to that. If you're not advertising on social media for an event, what are you doing, right? And even we have demographic studies that we get to do research of who are the people around our church or around our city, right? You can actually find these on our denomination's website. Because we're trying, and all of it is about trying to kind of reach our target audience and to try to compete with other churches, right? That's what we've done without maybe realizing it, right? And it's no wonder then that the normal people, those of you who have real jobs, right, that you shop for a church in the same way that you shop for other products, right? You judge a church based on convenience, the quality of the ministry, what can the church offer me? Do I fit here? My personality, right? Are the sermons relevant? Are they easy to listen to? Or is it a pain and I just want it to end, right? The worship style, all that kind of stuff. Does it fit my personal preference or my taste, and on, right? And at one level, this kind of consumerism is kind of, I think, a result of actually a good thing, that we live in a free country, right, where we're blessed to have religious freedom, where people can gather together like we are this morning without the fear of persecution or arrest, right? But with that freedom, churches have found themselves increasingly in kind of a competitive marketplace, right? Because today, unfortunately, as we've talked about over the last months, there are less and less people that attend church on a regular basis, right? It's just the reality of our context today. And so churches end up competing for a smaller and smaller and smaller group of people. I should have started my hands out like this, but that you get the idea, right? A smaller and smaller group of people. And the church doesn't just use business strategies. We often end up treating the church as a business, even as church people, right? We see the church as a vendor of religious goods and services, right? Just like Target gives us clothes and groceries or something, right? The church gives us their ministries, right? Music and sermons and children's ministries and youth ministries and Bible studies and whatever, right? And then we even have membership fees, and thankfully they're even optional. Like, you don't even have to pay, right? It's great. And then the facility, we want to make a welcoming space. It's clean and updated so that people want to spend time here, just like, you would at a Starbucks or something, right? So last week, we looked at this letter from Jesus, the resurrected King, to the church at Ephesus. And today we're going to move from Ephesus to Smyrna. So Smyrna is about 35 miles from Ephesus. We talked about last week that this letter of Revelation, really the entire book of Revelation is a letter, but then there's these 7 individual messages within it, but that the whole letter was passed from one of these 7 churches to the next. And it's possible, actually, that John, the writer of Revelation, actually sent a messenger on horseback from city to city, right? So the messenger would start in Ephesus, read the message aloud, and of the entire book of Revelation out loud to them, and then he would travel to the next city. So Smyrna is the next city, 35 miles from Ephesus. So Smyrna is a city that's been destroyed many times in civil wars and different conflicts, but then had been rebuilt. It had kind of had a resurrection of its own. Smyrna had a famous stadium, a library, the largest theater in the region, and it was really the second most important city in the area, only next to Ephesus that we talked about last week. So before the Romans became the dominant power that they were, we're looking at 1st century Asia. The Romans are the dominant power in the world. And Smyrna, before that had happened, though, a few hundred years earlier, Smyrna had sided with the Romans, but when they were still kind of rivaling with other empires. And so Smyrna, because of this, it kind of reaped the benefits, right? You can imagine it's kind of like backing an underdog. When that underdog actually wins, if you're a betting person, that's great, right? You kind of reap the benefits of believing in them when they were an underdog, right? That kind of thing. And so that's kind of what happened with the people of Smyrna. They backed the Romans, and then the Romans won. And so they built all kinds of temples to honor the emperor. They even had a goddess named Roma that kind of represents Rome as a whole, the empire, right? It's like the personification of the Roman Empire. And that goddess Roma becomes really important throughout the book of Revelation. But the idea is that this is a city that has kind of, against the odds, been rebuilt and resurrected, and they have the Roman Empire to thank for it. And they actually were given the nickname, the city that died yet lives. The people of Smyrna, of course, give the credit to the Romans. And again, that's why they built these temples to the emperor and to the goddess Roma. Rome had done them a great favor by rebuilding the city, right? And Smyrna was also surrounded by these great cliffs that were part of the skyline. And they constructed buildings next to these cliffs so that wrapping around the city were these cliffs and these tall buildings in a way that kind of looked like a crown. And so they actually would call the skyline of the city the crown of Smyrna, which the crown becomes, as we saw in our scripture, a really important image as well. They had really received a reward. And in the ancient world, people got crowns when they won an athletic victory, right? If you were in the ancient Olympic Games, the heroes, the people who won, would get a crown. People who won military battles would be given a crown. And in a sense, the city's buildings was like the crown for their city, right? They had backed the Romans, and now they got the reward for doing that. So that's the city of Smyrna. We have this great city rebuilt from the ashes, kind of resurrected because of its loyalty to Rome. So the church of Smyrna, the people who followed Jesus, probably worshiped together in homes in Smyrna, very different story for them. They faced threats then from 2 different directions. And the first was from the empire of Rome itself. So Rome is this giant empire, the largest empire the world had ever known at the time, right? They have all kinds of different peoples and ethnic groups, people that speak all kinds of different languages. They're trying to unite all of them under the authority of the Roman emperor, emperor, the Caesar, right? And so to be able to do that, part of it is about uniting people under the same language, but you also need more than that, right? That they spread the Latin around the world, and Latin came to dominate hundreds of years of world history because of the Romans. But you need more than just a language, right? You have to unite people around an idea, right? And as we know, in the United States, right, we try to unite our very large territory around an idea, right? And obviously at different parts of American history, whether or not that's going to work is always up in the air, right? But we feel that same kind of tension of uniting a society that's really large with lots of different cultures and languages and histories, and you have to try to unite them around an idea. And so for the Romans, that idea was what they called Pax Romana, which in Latin just means the peace of Rome. So the emperor and the Rome itself were seen as the bringers of peace to the world. They used all kinds of language that the Christians then used about Jesus, right? We sometimes get the thinking backwards. It was the followers of Jesus that adopted the Roman language to talk about what Jesus had done, in fact, where they thought that the Romans believed that it was Caesar that had brought peace to the world and the Romans that had brought peace to the world, but in fact, it was a fake peace. And the true bringer of peace is Jesus. So that's the kind of context, though, that Rome has brought this peace to the world. They made it orderly, right? They've set up a world where people can be at peace with each other, and we can just grow the economy. People can be wealthier than they've ever been before. And the people at Smyrna are really grateful for Rome's protection. But as part of what Rome wants to do, right, in uniting the people together around this idea of the peace of Rome, is also to unite the people around the emperor himself, right? It's always easier to unite around a charismatic leader, right? And so the citizens across the empire were encouraged to worship the emperor. And one way that they did this was once a year, they were supposed to burn incense on the altar to Caesar. And in fact, this was required by the Roman government. And when people offered the sacrifice, they burned this incense for the emperor. They were given a certificate to say that they had participated in their civic duty, right? The kind of equivalent for us might be that, you get those stickers after you vote that say, I voted, right? That's the kind of idea of what's happening, except it would be like an official thing and not just something that your grandma gave you after you voted, right? No offense to the grandmas that do that. It's a great public service. But the idea is that this was like your civic duty, right? It's not just a religious thing, it's a political statement because the government is doing it and it's your leader, right? The emperor who is asking for that kind of allegiance. So if you don't do it, you're seen as disloyal to the empire. And like I said earlier, our context is obviously very different in a lot of ways, right? Like we are blessed to live in the United States, a free country where free expression is protected by the Constitution, and sometimes it's expression that a lot of us are uncomfortable with, right? But that's kind of the point, right? Is that there's freedom for even people who disagree, even people who don't like the country, right? Like that's the greatness of American freedom, right? But even in our country, right, where the government will protect the right to protest, if somebody protests against the national anthem or the flag, right, which we've seen in recent years, they can expect to be looked down on, right? There are ramifications for people doing that, right? There's a quarterback who lost his job in the NFL because of that, right? There are ramifications for being seen as kind of disloyal or not patriotic. And that's in our free society, right, where the government protects that right. In the ancient world, individual rights, free expression, that is not even a thing they were thinking of, right? And so the people of Smyrna absolutely love the Romans too, right? It's not just the empire that's not going to protect those rights. The people too, like they love Rome. Rome's done so much for us. They've protected us. They've given us peace, right? They've rebuilt our city. So anyone who does not participate in those ceremonies of emperor worship is going to be in constant threat, not only from the Roman Empire itself, but even from the common people who love Rome. So on the one hand, we have that persecution, right, that's from the Romans and even the common people of Smyrna. But on the other hand, there's this other threat to the church at Smyrna, and I want to pull this up. This is, I think, verse 9. Jesus says this. This is Jesus talking to the church, remember. Jesus says, I know your afflictions and your poverty, yet you are rich. We'll come back to that in a minute. I know about the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. This is obviously really strong language, right? And before we go any further, I want to give a caveat. So passages like this, if you don't know, I know a lot of us don't know history very well, but a lot of passages like this in the Bible have been misused by Christians to mistreat Jews, anti-Semitism, persecution against Jews by Christians. There's all kinds of atrocities that Christians have done to Jews based partially on passages like this. And that's a terrible misuse of the passage, right? Jesus by no means wants Jews to be mistreated because of passages like this, right? That the correct response to opposition, even if it comes from Jewish people, the correct response of followers of Jesus is to pray for those who persecute us, right? To repay evil with good, right? And that is actually what the Christians in Smyrna have done. So why would a Jewish person in Smyrna have given Christians a hard time, right? Like, what is the background? Like, why would Jesus have had to say this and had this kind of harsh language for them? So the word that's translated slander, in the middle of that verse, the word translated slander is actually a technical word, right? It's not a bad translation, but it doesn't give us necessarily the nuance of what it would for somebody that was hearing this letter for the first time. It's kind of like, in their day, the word informant, or maybe the kind of slang term snitch, right? So the idea, our best guess, is that what actually was happening was that the Jews of Smyrna were actually telling the Roman authorities that Christians were disloyal to the empire, right? They're actually getting the Christians in trouble with the Romans. And so that's why Jesus has this harsh language for them. So we talked about that burning of incense, right, that you had to do, offering the sacrifice for the emperor or to the emperor every year and get that certificate saying you had done it. Well, Jews were actually given an exemption. They would get the certificate without actually having to burn the incense. It's a long and complicated history that the Romans and Jews had, but it was often bloody. There was a lot of war between them, and in general, the Romans were happy to just keep peace with the Jews. So as long as the Jews weren't going to start a war with them, they would kind of let them worship their own God. Pray for the emperor, but you don't have to worship him, was kind of the idea. So they got an exemption from the actual sacrifice to Caesar. It was just easier that way. But for early Christians, right, they see themselves as Jewish. And this is, again, kind of the complicated thing with when we see Jew in the New Testament, is that it means different things in different places, right? And actually, in this verse, he's kind of using Jew two different ways. There's a sense that the Jews are different than the Christians, right? Even though Jesus is Jewish and his first disciples are Jewish and all of that, a lot of the Jewish people rejected Jesus, though, even though Jesus saw himself as Jewish and trying to be a renewal of Judaism, right, around himself as the Jewish Messiah. Many Jews rejected him. And so you have kind of these Jews separated from Christians as the early church continues, the farther we get away from Jesus and his first disciples. And so it seems like what's probably happened here is that Christians are trying to claim the same exemption that the Jews had, because the Christians kind of see themselves still as Jews. Some of them were Jews, and some of them at least see themselves kind of as Jewish. They worship the Jewish Messiah, right? But Jews in Smyrna weren't having it, and they report on the Christians. And again, it's easy to kind of point fingers at them, as this letter even does, right? But if you're a Jew in Smyrna, you can imagine from their perspective, it would be easy to do. They're just trying to protect their own people. Like I said, the relationship with Rome is complicated. If the Christians try to claim the exemption that we have that's special, maybe they'll ruin things for us, right? So it could be that they were reporting on the Christians as a way of trying to protect themselves. Like, it's almost certain that that's what was happening, right? You could imagine if you felt like your own family's safety was at threat, you would be willing to out someone else to save your own family, right? It's certainly possible. Obviously, not a good thing to do, but you could understand why they would do it. That's probably what was happening. But from the perspective of our letter, Revelation, and Jesus who is speaking here, obviously that what they're doing is wrong, right? That they have actually decided, these Jews who have outed the Christians, have decided to side with the pagans, the Roman Empire, against God's people. And that's why he says they say they're Jews and they're not, because for the writers of the New Testament, they kind of saw themselves as the true Jews, right, who were following the way of Jesus, that the way to be a faithful Jew to the early Christians is to follow Jesus. Again, it gets complicated for us 2,000 years later, but that's the idea of why he's saying they're not actually Jews, because if you're really Jewish to a writer of the New Testament, that means you're a follower of Jesus. But Jesus it wants them to see that these people have sided with the enemy without even realizing it, right? And that's why he uses the term synagogue of Satan even, which is not language we would use today, but in their context makes sense. That Jesus wants them to understand that there's this hidden battle happening, and Revelation will go into that in much more detail, right? Between the forces of good and the forces of evil, and that Jesus is on the one side with his church. The people of Smyrna are included in that side, right? And on the other side are the forces of Satan warring against Jesus and his people. And that is what these Jews have unwittingly joined with, is the side of Satan. So hopefully that helps us understand this kind of hard to read passage. But the the Christians in Smyrna are not just in danger of arrest and execution, and that's the first part of the verse then reminds us that they also are poor, right? They're facing afflictions and poverty, and we think this is actual poverty, right? Material poverty, they don't have much money, and there are all kinds of reasons that happened to Christians in the early church as well. This first century time, there were all kinds of business and trade guilds and business associations that people had to join to be part of, to kind of make a living, right? Different community organizations, which don't sound bad, like we have kind of equivalents of those today. But in the ancient world, if you were part of one of those groups, you also had to make sacrifices to Roman gods and the emperor, right? And so a lot of early Christians saw this rightfully as idolatry, right? So they would not be part of these business groups because they didn't want to worship the emperor or the Roman gods. But when you do that, you also make it so you're not part of these trade associations and you can't do business very well, right? So it's very likely that their allegiance to Jesus kind of leaves them out of the inner circle of Roman society. And so when John says that in verse 9, that they are poor, that's what he means. But he also says, are actually rich. They don't have much money, they are poor, but at the same time they are rich, because this is one of only 2 churches in Revelation who are actually faithful to Jesus, right? He has no criticism to point out. They are an actual faithful church. They are rich where it counts in their faith. And so John assures them that their suffering is only going to be temporary, right? He says, you will suffer persecution for 10 days. There's all kinds of numbers in the book of Revelation, right? And almost every time, I can tell you, every time basically, they are symbolic, right? They're not numbers to be taken literally. And for the number 10 is probably one of these, and it is just refers to like a short time, a limited amount of time, right? It's longer than a day, but it's only a certain short amount of time. And so the idea here is that even if your persecution continues and even if it ends in your death, it's only temporary, that the end of your life is not actually the end of your life, right? And that's a major theme throughout the book of Revelation and in this letter, that if you're faithful even to the point of death, I will give you life as your victor's crown. And then there you see overcoming the second death idea as well. So throughout the New Testament, and I think this is so important for this church at Smyrna, that throughout the New Testament and all of Jesus' teaching, we are reminded of this kind of reversal, right? And Smyrna, again, is a great example of this, that the poor and the humble will be exalted when God's kingdom comes fully, and the rich and the proud will be humbled. This reversal, right? And so if you're a poor, persecuted church like those in Smyrna, that's good news, right? Because this life has been rough, right? You're poor and you're persecuted, but the next life will be good. When God's kingdom comes in its fullness, things will be reversed. And we see this. Jesus is the ultimate example of that kind of reversal of God's kingdom, right? Jesus is born in a lowly manger. He's a carpenter, right? He hangs out with sinners and fishermen and prostitutes and tax collectors, right? He's executed in a publicly shameful way, a way that is the worst way a person could die. And then he's raised from the dead and ascends and reigns as king, right? Which again is a huge theme in Revelation, this reversal for Jesus, right? Tax collectors and sinners are the ones that inherit his kingdom. They're the ones that accept Jesus. Meanwhile, the religious people miss it. And so with the church at Smyrna, that is the same kind of reversal that's happening, right? From the perspective of earth, you have the city of Smyrna seems great, right? The city has all this wealth and power. It has this crown that they've been given of the crown of the buildings in the mountains, right? And meanwhile, from that same perspective, the Christians of Smyrna are, they're poor, they're persecuted, they're the lowly, they're just dumb, right? Why won't you just offer the sacrifice? Why won't you just participate in these trade associations, right? Like, just be part of our world. Stop being troublemakers, right? But that's the earth perspective. From the perspective of Jesus, the city of Smyrna is the one that is poor, because they have placed their power or their hope and trust in those powers of Rome that will not survive the second death. The Roman Empire will only rule for a certain amount of time, and then it's done, right? And they certainly will not make it to eternity. And then on the other hand, from Jesus' perspective, this church of Smyrna is actually rich, because their members have reoriented their life around Jesus, and they one day will inherit that crown of life that can never be taken away. So this church, lowly in the eyes of the world, is actually great in the eyes of Jesus. So our context, as I've been kind of mapping out this morning, the world that Smyrna Christians lived is much, much different than the world that we live in. And as difficult as things are for Christians today, right, it's a changing world for us in all kinds of ways. But it's still, even in a changing world, it pales in comparison to the kind of difficulty that the early church faced, right, including the people at Smyrna. So how can we hear the message to a suffering church where the fear of death was real, right? That they would be killed for their faith. What can we learn as Christians in the United States and North America that are really blessed in a lot of material ways that the early church never knew? How can we read this letter in a kind of responsible way? What does Jesus have to say to us today? So it's easy for us to kind of focus on what the world focuses on, right? The kind of success in the ways of this world, the numerical growth, right? And unfortunately, we're encouraged to do that oftentimes even by our own denomination, right? We want to grow. We want our attendance and giving numbers to go to not only where they were in the past, but even higher, right? And if you do that, you're a successful church and a successful pastor. And if you don't, well, the opposite. And when we think that way, it becomes, really easy to appeal to church shoppers, right? We want to market the church better. We want a welcoming environment, all those things that Starbucks does, like we talked about at the beginning, right? We try to improve our ministries so that we have more to offer people who try out our church. And I don't want to say that all of that is bad. Like, we obviously do want more people to be part of our church, and really every church, right? Because Eastview and the Church of the Nazarene is a church that's focused on the Great Commission, right? Those words of Jesus that he gave his disciples to go into the nations and make disciples of all nations, right? We always want to be making more disciples. So we do want people to feel welcome, and we do want to reach more people, not because we want to reach church shoppers, right, and take people from another church or whatever, but because we want to help people who are far from God connect with God, right? That's what it's about. If people don't feel welcome when they come, they'll never stay long enough to connect with God and grow to become more like Jesus, and that is what it's all about. Like we talked about in last week a lot, being willing to change is an important thing as a church. But the biggest problem that many of us have isn't in the way we think about the kind of church marketing. You know, and to some extent, as pastor or leadership in the church, we sometimes get caught up in that. But the biggest problem for a lot of us, and that includes the people in leadership too, is that we get bogged down in our own personal preferences, right? That with this kind of attitude of consumerism. That for those of us who are already here, we want things to be the way that we like them, right? And it's easy to see ourselves as paying customers who are kind of entitled to a certain experience because of what we give, right? It's easy to slip into that kind of thinking without realizing it, right? We don't realize kind of the ways that we have expectations of what the church owes us, right? But the truth of the matter is that the church only exists because, as an organization, because of the people of the church, because the people are actually the church, right? You and me. So there's not a church that exists as this kind of nebulous thing that owes us stuff and should do things to accommodate us, right? The church is you. The church is me, right? The church is that the truth is that we are the church. And the church doesn't exist to please its members, right? The church exists to bring honor and glory to Jesus and to be faithful witnesses of Jesus to the world. And so today that might be the way that the Spirit is speaking, as John says, as Jesus says here in Revelation. The Spirit may be speaking to you today about that kind of issue. Like maybe today you need to surrender your own preferences. Maybe today you've made gathering together as God's people about you, right? Or about us instead of Jesus, right? Which is the reason we are here. And if we do that, we've missed the point, right? But Jesus invites us into much more than being consumers. The church at Smyrna is a faithful example of what the church is supposed to be, right? When they faced persecution, they didn't try to slander the Jews back to the Romans, right, and get them in trouble, right? They took whatever punishment came. They prayed for those who persecuted them. They were faithful until the end, no matter what it cost them. And Jesus is asking us to lay down our own lives, even if we don't face the kind of persecution that they faced. Surrendering to Jesus is what is required of us. Jesus invites us to have that same kind of perseverance, the same kind of patient endurance, and the same kind of witness in the world as that church at Smyrna. So Jesus really invites us into that mission, the kingdom of priests that he calls us to be, as we've talked about the last few weeks. So I want to close this week with this question, and we'll have a time of prayer around it as well. The question on the screen: how can we, with the Holy Spirit, connect someone to God this week, right? How can God is working in the hearts and lives of every person that we come into contact with, your friends, your family, the cashier at the store, everyone, right? The person that cuts your hair, whatever. God is working on their hearts. The Holy Spirit is reaching out to them and is trying to connect to them. And different people have different levels of resistance, right, to God's working. But what God calls us to do is to help people make that connection, to hear the Spirit in their lives. So how can you share that love of Jesus this week? How can you connect someone else with God? How can you encourage someone or speak into their life? How can you give hope where there is no hope? How can you really join with what God's doing in someone else's life this week? I think that is really what it means to be the kingdom of priests. So as the worship team comes, I'll have you guys come up, but I also want to give us some time to pray beforehand. And I don't